so it looks like there are a couple of open questions. Dana said, what time were we supposed to be back? And it's now. So if you're just joining us, that is totally fine. I'm trying to think if I see any more. I don't think there's anything in the chat section except Kevin's comment. So, okay. Again, as we go along, please feel free to put something in there. And we are going to pick up where we left off. So let me, share the screen again. Here we go, everybody. Okay, looks like you guys can see my screen and we are going to go on ahead. So we've been talking about what, as I said, we're sometimes called big T trauma or capital T trauma that may be repeated events, but all it takes is for it to happen once for it to be potentially life-altering. But there's another kind of trauma too, which you may have guessed is called little t. So let's talk about that a little bit. Here's an example of what could be called an ordinary life trauma or a little t trauma. Feeling different, not being accepted, not being able to do something other people can do, moving to a new home or having a significant change at home, knowing that you're different from other people in some way, not being listened to, being misunderstood, failing at a task, getting confused and overwhelmed. Now, some of you might be thinking, as I was the first time I saw this, that it's strange in a way to call this trauma because I could have just labeled this slide 7th grade, right? These are things that if you have been alive long enough, you have experienced and probably will again someday. I've done this hundreds of times with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and I guess now probably thousands of people in live audiences. And whenever I say, raise your hand if you've never experienced one of the things on this list, any one of the things, then nobody ever raises their hand. So if some of these things happening is just a part of human life from time to time, why are we including it in a training about trauma? The issue with little t traumas is not how severe they are, but how frequently they happen. So if it's something that just happens occasionally, or, if you have a tough couple of months or something, that's one thing. And again, it may be a stress. That stress may or may not turn into trauma. But what we're looking at here is when it happens over and over and over and over and over and over. And actually, it's not just about the frequency. There's another piece to it too. And to describe this, I'm going to have you guys, again, just kind of relate to yourselves a little bit. I'm not going to ask you to share this, so don't worry about that. But I want you to take a moment and we'll pick something on this list. Let's see. I'm going to pick failing at a task. Okay. So I want you to, if you've been taking notes or, shopping online or something secretly while we're doing this, just pause for a second. And I want you to just go inside for a minute and I want you to think about a time that you failed. And it should be something that, was pretty important to you, right? It's not just like, oh, I guess this just, skiing isn't for me. It's not that. It's something that you really tried and you really failed. And maybe it was important. Maybe other people saw you fail at it. How did that feel? And my guess is if I could see you guys, what I would see is some heads going like this and some body language going like, ugh. That did not feel good, did it? For some of you, those may be very, very vivid memories. And I'm going to confess something to you guys. I cheated a little bit. I picked that one on purpose because I know something about you. I know something about every one of you guys, even though I have never met you guys. And what I know is this, that most, if not all of you in this audience today, really hate failing and you're really good at not doing it. Okay. And why do I know that without ever having met you? Because you guys all have really important, responsible jobs. And if you weren't good at not failing, you would not have that job, right? What you do is sometimes a matter of life and death for someone. And I'm not exaggerating. So what happens when people don't like failing and they have ways of dealing with it? Well, two things really that we should think about. The first one is, I certainly can think of times in my life, I'm going to guess that most, if not all of you can as well, that when you failed at something, there were people around to pick you up again, right? And they were not people you paid to be in your life. Now, I'm a therapist. I think it's great to have somebody that helps you that you may or may not pay, right? Like we should all be in therapy. So that's not what I'm talking about, or even like a pastor or someone like that. Those are really important roles for many of us. But what I mean is you have family and friends who are not paid to be there, who care about you. That's pretty important, right? So the people who said, you'll get them next time, don't worry about it. Like that was really helpful, I think, in having something that was a failure not become a trauma. The other thing that most, if not all of you guys have at your disposal is you've probably got really good strategies for when this happens to you. You either try again, make the test a testament, figure out how to turn it around, or you figure out how to shift gears so that you're doing something that you are going to be successful at, right? I worked in telemarketing for 2 whole weeks and I was terrible at it. I've had a lot of jobs I was terrible at. Actually, I was a terrible bartender. I was a bouncer. I was actually pretty good at that. That's a story for another time, frankly. The point is, I have not been equally successful at every job I've ever had or everything I've tried to do. And I was pretty good at either building the skill I needed or shifting to something where I could use my talents better, right? So once again, and as we will do throughout this training, I want you to pause for a minute and think about the people that you support or the people that your staff support if you're a manager or leadership or whatever. Do those folks usually have lots of natural supports, natural support being someone who is not mandated or paid to be in their life? And again, that is not saying anything about the wonderful, amazing people that they have around them who are professionals. I'm simply saying it's different, right? So, do they have a whole bunch of natural supports of people who are encouraging and enthusiastic and there for them? Some of them are blessed enough to have that. Many of them don't, right? And how many of the folks we support have a wide range of options in terms of building their skill or shifting away from something that they don't feel successful at so they can do something else? How many people have lots of opportunities to even explore what they're good at? Like this is not a training about employment, and I think any work is honorable work. But how many of our folks do work that's like cleaning offices, which is great, and maybe they love it. Some people do. But a lot of our folks don't have the same opportunities that we did to try different things and to find where our talent lies. That actually is something that we talk about in a separate training that we may or may not be doing with Dungarvin. But the point remains, a lot of folks with dual diagnosis, with developmental disabilities, they don't have those two things. And that means that those little T traumas that is maybe like a bump in the road for you is a boulder for them. And because a lot of them experience them because of chronic situations. Let's pick some other ones. Feeling different from other people, not being listened to or being misunderstood. Oh my God, how many people do we support in our field who either struggle with verbal communication or English isn't their first language, or the people around them, English is not their first language, whatever. There's a language mismatch. Can you imagine? I think about this a lot, actually. It's a little bit of one of my personal nightmares. You may not be surprised to hear this, actually, with the time that you've spent with me, that not being able to speak, not being able to communicate and be understood by people is terrifying to me. I cannot imagine how stressful that is to just go through a day with people consistently misunderstanding you. So so when we talk about little t trauma, what we're really seeing is that some of these experiences, if you think of some of the folks you work with, teenagers, adults, older adults, whatever, some of them experience a few or many things on this list day after day after day after day after week after month after year after decade. Some of you who work with older folks, and we are fortunate that many of the medical conditions that folks are born with, we now understand better, can treat better. And so we have a much longer life expectancies for a lot of our folks, which is a great blessing. But it, in this case, also means that we may be talking to people with multiple decades of daily stressors, without the same kind of resources and supports that other people may have. And so what we see is that you can have a big T, life-altering, maybe single event that can cause traumatic change in the brain and body. And or you can have a bunch of little ones, and given enough time, they end up in the same place. They look the same. Changes to the brain and body look the same. People with chronically high cortisol levels, people with compressed regions of the brain and other regions of the brain that are too active, maybe too big. That is the result of severe extreme overloads of traumatic stress. And that can happen all at once or in little tiny doses. And when we talk about the incidence of trauma, remember I said before our break that the big T trauma life events, if you have a developmental disability, you are statistically more likely, obviously not guaranteed, but more likely to have experienced one of those traumatic events, or maybe many of them. Now add this part. I've seen many different instruments that try to measure or count how many potentially traumatic events someone may have had in their life. The ACEs scale, other things, great. I've never yet seen an instrument that measures how many times a day someone feels devalued, how many times a day someone struggles to be understood, how many times a day someone feels confused or overwhelmed about what's going on around them. Maybe someday we'll come up with that instrument. But when you put those two things together, big T and little t trauma, here's my favorite quote about them. This is from someone I am proud to call a friend who actually works at the Ohio Department of Mental Health. It's got a longer name now about addiction services, but the Ohio Department of Mental Health is really focusing on first responder wellness, and he is leading a nationally regarded initiative about this. He's a retired lieutenant of the Ohio Highway Patrol, and he talks a lot with law enforcement and first responders about their exposure to trauma in the course of their job. And this is how he explains big T and little t to them. Okay, so this is not a touchy-feely group of people, as you can imagine, and this is how he helps them understand it. A big T trauma is like being attacked by a bear. And you can imagine a bear attack is going to leave a lot of damage, very visible, right? No one's going to be confused. Little t is like being attacked by ducks. And if it's just the occasional duck every once in a while, you can probably deal with it. But if it's a lot of ducks every day, over time, that damage is going to start to look the same. And I think it's very accurate that he used ducks in this example and not geese, because personally, I think I might be more afraid of geese than I am of bears. Geese are terrifying. But anyway, the point is, it can be this big thing that blows everything apart, or it can be these little things that erode. Put them both together. When we look at big T and little t for people with developmental disabilities, multiple estimates, so different researchers trying to estimate just how prevalent is traumatic stress in this population, the rates are higher than 90%, more than 90%, you guys. So really think about this for a second. I don't want to pull this back up and slow us down, but I think we have about 70 people in the training today. More than 90% of that, so that would be like what, 60 plus out of 70 have potentially significant levels of traumatic stress. That's how widespread this is in our population. So when we talk about trauma responsive care, and I'm going to explain why it's different than trauma informed care. When we talk about trauma responsive care being important, we are talking about something that affects more than 9 out of 10 of the people you will serve in your career. More than 9 out of 10 of them. Okay, I just call that everybody. I just think that's easier to say everybody. And we'll talk about why it's okay to sort of make up that gap when we talk about trauma responsive care as a universal precaution. Okay, so I've referred to this quickly. I'm just going to say this. Trauma is worse when we're young. And it makes sense, right? Imagine a fire in a building. If it's an established building and it's got a sprinkler system and it's all built and painted and everything, that fire can certainly cause damage. Now imagine a fire at a construction site where there's just a wooden frame. Which one is going to cause more damage? right? So the reason I make such a point about this, there are two reasons. One is that I've heard a lot of variations on, well, we know that Lara experienced some stress in her early childhood. Moving foster parents are going to know exactly what I'm talking about here. Moved from placement to placement, parents lost custody, la 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 la, whatever. But all of it happened before Lara was 5, and she doesn't remember it, so we don't think it affected her. Wrong, 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 wrongity, wrong, wrong. Um, I may not have a conscious memory of what happened, but my body and nervous system may very well have been affected by whatever pain or fear I may have experienced. Okay. And anything that threatens connection with my caregivers, if I'm an infant or a very young child, is potentially traumatizing. So again, it's not just mistreatment. It's not simply if I've been abused in some way, although obviously that can cause trauma. But even if it's something like my caregivers were overwhelmed with my care, they were depressed, they were struggling with mental health issues or addiction issues of their own, if there was a lot of chaos and I was, bumped around from place to place to place a lot, that damages my little developing brain's ability to connect with a safe, calming, soothing adult brain. I'm not going to talk about this in this training. It is something we talk about in my book, if this is something that's interesting to you, but there's a much bigger conversation now around attachment styles. When something becomes TikTok famous, a lot of the nuance gets lost. So don't just go to TikTok for this. But I will just say how we experience the world, if there's someone around us who is consistently calm and nurturing, and the world feels predictable, and we have a routine as our brains are developing, let's say 0 to 3, that's the foundation and the framework and the wiring of the house. And if something interferes with that, you've got a house that maybe can't be even built, right? So anything that happens early in life is more damaging, even if the person can't remember it consciously. Do not fall for that. For teens, social isolation, social pain, we are seeing a wave of trauma to teens, I think specifically after the pandemic, and whatever side of the spectrum you're on in terms of what you think should have happened in terms of how the pandemic was handled. Regardless of that, the result is many of us experience different levels of being cut off from other human beings. And for teenagers, it was already a problem with cyberbullying and kind of how things work online, which is different than real life. And then a lot of them, that became their whole world, and it did not go great, is all we need to say about that. And for adults, any kind of loss. So in my private practice, I work with trauma and grief and loss primarily. And there are some losses that in and of themselves are traumatizing because the pain of that loss of connection is so intense. So again, just keeping in mind, trauma isn't just mistreatment. Trauma isn't just someone being physically hurt by another person. It can take all these other forms as well. So what do we do with all of this? I'm going to talk in a little bit about the brain and the body, and we'll begin that conversation and probably wrap it up partway through that and pick it up when we come back next week. You'll notice that I've referred several times to this training as being trauma responsive care. And this is a moment to talk about that. Many, if not all of you, have had some form of trauma-informed care. When we met with leadership at Dungarvin and then later got to spend a day with some of your leadership folks, we asked how many people in the room had had some kind of trauma-informed care, and that was most people. And as I mentioned earlier, when I started kind of in this dual diagnosis world as a liaison between mental health, my world, and developmental disabilities, that was, I got that job in 2009. That was 15 years ago, which is incredible. And at that time, trauma was not in the conversation at almost at all in Ohio, and I would argue in most of the country in developmental disabilities. We were just a little behind. That has changed a lot in Ohio, around the country. Dungarvin actually has one of the higher rates that we've seen of providers that are offering trauma-informed care information and trauma-informed care training for staff. So there's certainly a lot of growing to do still. But it used to be, when I started lecturing about trauma, it was because I saw such a big gap, and so many of our folks were affected. Keep that in mind, right? More than 90% are affected by trauma, and at that time, almost no counties or providers or agencies were really thinking about or talking about trauma that was affecting more than 90% of their people. So when I was at the state, and then later when my business partner and I kind of struck out on our own, that was the intent. That's why we did this, was to close that gap and to talk about trauma. So people have made giant strides. And now when I talk with an audience, if I had you guys in the room and I asked, how many of you have had some kind of trauma-informed care training, either at a previous job or through your current job, or it's something that's interesting to you? It's much more part of the popular conversation now than it used to be. Most of you would raise your hand for some reason, right? One of those things. A lot of people have had the SAMHSA training. There are different models out there, the sanctuary model, the covenant, whatever. And if you break those down conceptually, they do a couple of things. They explain what trauma is, which we've also been kind of reviewing today so far, and that you understand how big of a problem it is in our society, okay? And it will sometimes talk about people who've experienced trauma need to feel safe and in control, which makes sense because we've talked about one way to define trauma is something that makes you feel unsafe and out of control long enough, intensely enough to cause a trauma, right? Okay. I wanted to go to the next step. It's great to be informed. You have to know something exists to start. But then what? What's the next thing? And the next thing is to be able to respond to it. And I chose the word respond because so often, whether it's the individual we're supporting who's experienced trauma, or we're the person trying to deal with them and trying to help them and trying to understand, and they may be acting in a way that's off-putting or scary or bizarre or dangerous or harmful, whatever. It's just, they are reacting. Okay, reacting is when we're not thinking, and we'll talk in a little bit about exactly in brain terms what's going on. But remember my professor in the movie theater, when he leapt out of his chair and started screaming, he wasn't thinking. If he'd thought, he would have remembered that he was in a movie theater. That was not possible for his brain at that moment. His body, he had a full body reaction, much faster than the ability to think. Tenths of a second faster, which is in brain time a really long time. Okay, so he reacted. And I have done this work for a long time. I started out as a little hourly worker, working with teenagers. I certainly had my share of reacting to what the kids were doing because it's scary or stressful or annoying or frustrating or hard or whatever. And so people with trauma can be reacting, and we can be reacting to their reaction. What I wanted was to help people understand enough and to build some skill, which is mostly what we're going to be doing in the second half next week, to respond. Responding means you're thinking as well as feeling. Responding means you have some choices. Responding means you are present and grounded. Okay, and you have all of that information available to you, not just your amygdala going wah, 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 which is what happens when we're reacting. So trauma responsive care is how we train ourselves to make room for or provide space for or hold space for someone who may be experiencing a trauma reaction, or maybe trauma has pervaded every part of their being. It's how they move through the world every day. And we are responding to them in a different way. What we'll see is that it actually allows us to have better outcomes in the moment, but also better outcomes over time with that person. And I believe is their best chance for experiencing some healing from their trauma. So we're now going to talk about what is going on in the brain and body so that we can understand and be responding. Okay, I'm going to go through these. All right, I'll talk about this like super quickly, and then I want to get to the brain. As I mentioned, I just want you guys to have this information so that if you see in someone's chart or someone's talking about someone being diagnosed with PTSD, this is what they're talking about. To give someone a diagnosis, there are a couple of different conditions that have to be met. which I won't get into, but among them there are 4 symptom clusters, okay, 4 little groupings of symptoms, and they're like someone has to score like 5 out of 8 or 7 out of 10 or something in each one of these areas, depending, to get that diagnosis of PTSD. So just so you know, when someone's been given that diagnosis, they had to have something going on in all 4 of these areas, okay? Now, some of the symptoms of hypervigilance we've already kind of talked about, and that is stuff like an exaggerated startle response. This person, like, startles super easily. They're really jumpy. They're irritable. They have difficulty concentrating. They have difficulty relaxing. They have difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep. Now, you guys, this is a good example right now. You guys work with people with complex brain conditions, and some of them may have disrupted sleep or wake cycles. If someone's vision impaired, that can really mess up their circadian rhythm. I worked with teenagers. Teenagers are naturally vampires. They want to stay up all night. But even on top of all of that, think about any of you who work in any kind of residential setting, like a group home. Think about how many times you have power struggles with your individuals about going to bed or staying in bed, or they want to sleep on the couch with you in the living room. And think about why that might be. It might be because it's very hard for them to relax enough to fall asleep, and being around someone is reassuring. It may be that they don't want to sleep in their room because that's when bad stuff happened to them. But we tend to get into power struggles around sleep, and we may not fully understand what's going on. All right, the next group used to be called constriction. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but remember I said that a lot of people can go through life kind of numb and checked out. It's because we make ourselves smaller and smaller and smaller to control not being triggered, right? That is so awful that we try to just make ourselves as small as possible to avoid that happening, okay? That may also result in things like tactile defensiveness or getting kind of rigid about routines. If I have planned out my day and I can kind of manage that and then something unpredictable happens, I may freak out about it. And you may look at me and be like, I used to have a little slogan among my staff that it's not about the applesauce. I may be freaking out about the applesauce. I may be yelling about the applesauce, but that's not really what's going on with me. It's not about the applesauce. Okay. Next thing, intrusion. This is what people think of when they think of PTSD usually. So my professor had a flashback, and a flashback, as we already talked about, that's not a thought. It's not a memory. His nervous system throughout his body reacted as if he were in that situation again. Okay. We could say that his body was in a movie theater in Columbus, Ohio, and his nervous system, his mind, his psyche was in Vietnam. Okay. Nightmares, intrusive thoughts, these kinds of things. This is intrusion. And then finally, negative alterations in cognition and mood. As usual, the DSM finds a really fun, colorful way of saying this. Simple language would say, having this experience or series of experiences makes you feel bad about yourself and other people, and it can affect your mood and make you prone to other kinds of anxiety and depression. That makes sense, right? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about reactions to safety. We'll start talking about what's going on in the brain and body. That'll probably take us to the end of the hour. I'm going to leave a little bit of time for comments, and then we will finish up with the brain and the body, and then talk about the calmer skills in our time together next week. So let's do this as kind of our last big topic. So all organisms, from the tiniest little amoeba on a slide from like your high school biology all the way up to us human beings, we are constantly trying to figure out if our environment is good for us or not. Okay, so imagine a little amoeba in the ocean, right? Or a little plankton or something in the ocean. Is the water warm? Is the water cold? Is it too salty? Is it not salty enough? Is a shark about to eat me? I hope you guys appreciate the theater component to this. And we have different ways to react to that, right? We can run away, we can make ourselves small, we can fight, we can do whatever. That's true deeply in our nervous system. That's why I'm making the point about all life forms have some form of this, okay? This will be important later, but I'll just say this briefly now. As I mentioned before, this is much, much faster than our ability to think. Okay. It has already, that train has left the station. If there's something in my environment, I like to use the example kind of like I used before with a smoke detector. Now let's make it a fire alarm, like the fire alarm in the building where you are. If you're at work, let's say, especially, those things are ear shattering. I hate them. Even when it's a drill and I know it's about to happen, I hate it. It scares me. It freaks me out, which is exactly what it's supposed to do, right? So that ear splitting noise changes my environment, and my brain and nervous system go, oh, I'm not safe anymore, right? Okay, so when that happens, I go into what you may have heard of, I'm sure you have, as fight or flight. That's what most people know, the first two, fight or flight. I'm going to fight the danger, or I'm going to run away from the danger, right? Okay, unless it's a goose, then I run away every time. So fight or flight, I'm mobilized for safety. My brain starts pumping out norepinephrine and cortisol, which will be important later. That triggers the release of adrenaline and cortisol all through my body. It triggers the adrenal glands on top of my kidneys. I'm flooded with adrenaline. If you ever have been really adrenalized like that, you know how powerfully mobilizing that is. In fact, if you feel shaky or wobbly, it's because there's so much adrenaline in your system that your muscle fibers are twitching out of control. And that's why you feel kind of wibble wobbly, which, yes, is the scientific term for that, wibble wobbly. So fight or flight. There's a third one that people know a little bit more about now, but it's still maybe less familiar, and that is freeze. Okay. So right now, imagine that I'm a prey animal. I'm like a rabbit. Okay. And I'm in a field and there's a hawk flying overhead. Well, what do a lot of prey animals do? They freeze, right? So and fortunately, I'm already kind of camouflaged by my covering. And then if I'm still, the hawk can't see me. It can see me much more easily if I'm moving. And so I'm still, but I'm still very activated. I'm flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and I'm like, and as soon as that hawk flies away, do I just chill out and take a nap? Nope. Boop, I bolt for my hole or whatever. Okay. So there's fight, flight, and freeze. Now, freeze can look like shutdown, which we're going to talk about next, but they are not the same. They're at opposite ends of the spectrum. So we've got fight, flight, freeze. The last one is fawn. So keeping with our animal theme here, this does not refer to a baby deer. But what it refers to is moving closer to a threat to neutralize it. Okay. So in human beings, what this looks like, and this is primarily where we see it, is if the thing that is making me feel unsafe is another person, and I am trying to get them to be less threatening, then I might do things like smile. I might be very passive or very placating. I might do whatever they say, do whatever they want. I might be very flirtatious or friendly or sexual or whatever it is, whatever I need to do to get them to stop doing whatever it is that is making me feel unsafe, I will do it. We can see this in both male and female identifying people, but it's already kind of socialized into women. So that smile or that laugh or being friendly or flattering or whatever, women are already deeply trained to do this. So we do sometimes see it more frequently in women, but we can see it in men as well. And it is just like the other ones, a deeply embedded in our nervous system, much faster than we can think. I make this point because when I work with people with trauma, sometimes they don't like the way they reacted, and they may feel like they should have done something different, which is fine. That's a bigger conversation. What I always try to do is to help them find some compassion for the fact that their nervous system evolved to do some form of that over millions and millions of years. And it is much faster than the self-aware thinking parts of our higher brain. That, as I said, that train left the station long before you even recognize you're doing it. Once you recognize it, you can do something else if you want to, but these are deeply instinctual protocols written into our nervous system to do. Okay, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Boop. All right. Mobilized for safety, high levels of adrenaline, high levels of cortisol in the body. Okay. Now, I referred to there being like a continuum. So I'm going to, yeah, let me just jump to this one. Okay. On the previous slide, the top four, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, were hyperarousal. Arousal just means how active is your nervous system, your heart rate, sweating, body temperature, blood pressure, breathing, all of that stuff. How activated is it? Most of us, most of the time, spend our time in that middle band there, right? That, depending on your screen, white or cream band. Therapists, trauma therapists call this the window of tolerance. It just means whatever's going on around you is okay. You may like it, you may not like it, but it's not freaking you out. It's not causing a threat to you. It's tolerable. So you're in your window of tolerance. And hopefully, most of us, most of the time, have a pretty wide window. It takes a lot, like a fire alarm, to activate us into fight or flight. That's why fire alarms are so loud. They want to freak you out so that you drop what you're doing and get out of the building. That's the point. So the other end of the spectrum, that hypoarousal, hypo just means under, like hypodermic needle is under the skin. Hypoarousal is when our nervous system drops into shutdown. To illustrate what I'm talking about, let's think about that rabbit again, okay? Except this time it's been caught by a wolf, all right? And it's not trying to run away from the wolf and it's not trying to hide from the wolf, it's caught. What would the rabbit do? It might struggle for a second, but when it can't get the wolf to drop it, is it going to be stiff like a board? No, it's going to go, it's going to be limp, right? That is also a prey animal reaction. Why? Because they don't want to stick around for what's about to happen. Fair enough. I would not either. And so all the power gets cut off. Okay, let me go back just for a second here. So this is, I am shut down for safety. I went to a training where a guy described it beautifully. He said, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, hyper arousal is like the building's emergency systems are all going off at the same time. So there's sirens and alarms and lights are flashing and brr, brr, brr. It's all happening at once to get you away. Collapse and dissociation is shutdown, and that's like the power's been cut. The building is dark, the building is cold, the door is locked, nobody can get in or out. Okay, so it's shutdown. The stillness of it can look like freeze, but you can see now why they're actually at opposite ends of the spectrum. About 2/3 of the population naturally, without any trauma history, will go first into hyperarousal. But all of us will eventually go down into collapse if we are stuck for too long. So you can imagine me in that car when I got kind of crushed into the car and I couldn't get out. At first, I might be frantically trying to get out, but if I'm there for hours, by the time, the ambulances and the fire trucks show up, I might be pretty numb and pretty inert, pretty shut down, right? Because I've now gone into a state of collapse. Learned helplessness is a version of this to some extent. Dissociation just means that two things that are put together that are usually connected are now separated. You have probably experienced this in the folks you work with, but you may not have known it. When a common example of this is when someone is talking about something that is upsetting, that should naturally be upsetting to talk about, that's upsetting for you to hear, but they say it in a very way, that's quite possibly a dissociation. The emotion and the words, which normally go together, have been separated. They have disassociated from each other. As I mentioned, when I worked with people who had experienced torture, I'll never forget this one man who came in. It was his first or second session. I would never have started that early in treatment asking him to talk about what he experienced. I think I said something like how his week had been or how he was doing that day. I don't know. He started rattling off his story, which is not uncommon for people who've had to tell their story a lot, like to the government or whatever. And he told me some of the most distressing things I've ever heard from a human being. And I've worked with trauma for 30 years. I've heard a lot of trauma. This was so hard to listen to that I had to fight really hard not to burst into tears. And you guys, he told me these things as if he was reading off a shopping list. No emotion. Now, why this is so important in our training about sensitizing us to trauma and being responsive to trauma is that if you don't know trauma, you might look at that and think, oh, he's dealt with it. It's not a big deal. No, what you're seeing is he has checked out. He is in a state of dissociation. Those two things are not together. Um, in extreme cases, it can be things like where people lose time or don't know how they got where they are, wake up in a different city. That's very rare. It can happen. Um, collapse also is different from freeze because freeze tends to look rigid, right? Like this, and collapse is limp, right? You probably see some of your folks do this. Some people will actually go into a fetal position, but other people, they just kind of just kind of curl in a little bit. Once you see it, once you know what you're looking at, you'll see it all the time. So as we wrap up today, I'm going to leave you guys with this. Remember when I said that the brain gets better at whatever we ask it to do a lot of. This is great news if you're trying to learn how to drive a car or play a musical instrument or play a sport. Yay, we want the brain to learn, right? This is bad news, at least in the beginning, when it comes to trauma, because the brain gets good at that too. So remember when we talked about my professor leaping out of his chair and screaming, or me like trapped in my car and kind of checked out and in a collapse state. If that only happens every once in a great while, which is what it's meant to, just like you're not meant to have a fire in your building every day, it's an emergency. Hopefully it never happens. Then what happens is your brain can move in and out of that state and then you can come back down and you're okay. But imagine if that happens over and over and over and over. And remember, this is what we talked about when we said big T, little t trauma together, more than 90%. If this is happening a lot to someone's brain, especially early in life, especially severe stress, and especially repeated or chronic, well, the brain gets better at it. It goes into that state more easily. It takes longer to come down. And if it's really severe, eventually you get this. You get people walking around who spend most of their waking hours and some of their sleep time, if they have nightmares, in a state of hyper or hypoarousal. Their time out of that is very narrow. And you know some of those people, even if you haven't identified them that way, they're the ones where they're like, you know that once they get set off, that's it. That's your shift. That's the day. We're going to be doing this all day or all night. The reason for that might be because they go into that state of dysregulation, right? Their regulated brain, the up, down, back, front, side to side brain isn't here and now and talking to each other. It's dysregulated. They're in their emergency protocol. The fire alarms are going off. It's much, much easier for them to get to that state, and they stay there much, much longer, and it's harder to get them out of it. So that the fact that the brain learns is bad news for trauma. But as we'll see at the end of our training, by the time we get through the end of next week, we will see that that turns out to be good news as well. So here's what I'm going to ask of you, and I will check the questions. So let me go ahead and pause the slides, and I'm going to pause the recording or stop the recording.